Hello, Alex here, and in this second video on Harman Phoenix, this is where the fun begins. I spoke about this film in greater detail in the My First Roll video, but Harman Phoenix is a brand new color negative film from the new Harman Photo. If you want to see all the technical information about it, please check that other video out, because here we're going to focus on shenanigans. For anyone who isn't familiar with the concept of pushing film, it's just the idea of underexposing in camera and then overdeveloping in the development process to compensate. If you underexpose without overdeveloping, you're just underexposing. Pushing is specifically the combination of those two things. Generally, when you push your film, you get increased contrast, a loss of shadow detail, coarser grain, and in the case of color film, color shifts. But if a film pushes well, then in certain conditions, you can make that choice to get a more usable shutter speed without needing to use a faster lens, maybe use a flash, or without using a tripod. So there's a trade-off to be had, and pushing is a potentially useful tool sometimes. Knowing that the film is contrasty and grainy anyway, I decided to lean into that a bit and see, if you make it contrastier and more grainy, does it really make much of a difference? And Harman said that you could underexpose the film by 1 stop and rate it at 400 if you chose to, and you would get decent results. So I didn't think that pushing it 1 stop would be useful. And pushing it 3 stops is a bit much because most films don't do that well when you push them 3 stops. Not really that well. So I settled on 2 stops as a fairly reasonable balance. Here are the details of how I shot, developed and scanned this roll of Phoenix. So just a quick look at the Negs to start. This is my box speed roll and this is the one pushed 2 stops. My light panel isn't big enough to show both at the same time. Overall, the negative density on the pushed roll looks okay. Looking at the box speed roll, the highlights look about the same in both cases, more or less, within reasonable margin of error for metering and the different brightnesses of the scenes. But what stands out is the thin parts of the negatives. So say where most of the shots on the box speed roll, more or less, have a very well-defined rectangle where you can see the borders of the image. When I was scanning these, I actually couldn't tell where some of them started and ended because you have your highlights and then just nothing around it, especially shots like this one here or this one especially. I mean, there's a bit of highlight there. I think the shadows here were like metered -3, -3.5 stops. So like what, zone 2, zone 1.5, and there's just nothing there. So shadow detail is pretty much not a thing. In a couple of shots, I did bracket by half a stop, and giving it that extra half a stop, so rating it at, 580, between 500 and 640, actually gave much better results. So you could potentially underexpose it a stop and a half and push it 2 stops in development to increase the speed and get usable results. Overall, the increase in contrast and grain doesn't seem to be that big a deal. For night photography, you could shoot it at 800 no problem because you probably have very dark shadows that are just black nothingness anyway. Just don't underexpose your highlights because that's where you're going to actually keep some detail. Colors overall seem pretty good. I don't see any noticeable shifts, but the grain does mask detail and that kind of thing. And overall, I would say it actually pushed reasonably well 2 stops. When I heard that Phoenix doesn't have an orange mask in the base, my first and immediate reaction was E6 processing, let's make slides. The E6 process is used to generate positive images, slides, for films like Ektachrome, Velvia, that kind of thing. Aside from the lack of an orange mask, the other thing you need though is a clear base. So when I got my rolls, I clipped the leader of one of them, bleached and fixed it, and sure enough, it's extremely clear with a slight violet or lavender tint like you see with the negatives. In the case of Kodak Aerocolor, a very similar film in this regard, it has a slight orange tint to the base which gives a blue cool tone to your final slides, so you'd use a warming filter to add more warmth and get decent looking slides that way. Without the warming filter, they don't look so good. In this case, with the sort of violet lavender tint, you would expect maybe sort of greenish yellow tint to your slides. Aside from all that, in a general sense, when you cross-process color negative film to make slides, you have to overexpose, push, or both to get decent contrast and decent density in your final slides. In this case, I mostly shot at around 200 because I thought the very clear base would work in my favor. That turned out not to be the case. And I shot most of these images with a warming filter just to see how that would affect the final images. The full details of how I shot, developed, and scanned the roll are on screen now. Taking this roll of standard slide film as a baseline, this is what we have. The difference is pretty ridiculous. Everything is just blue and green. On camera, things are rendering a bit more purple than they are in person. These blues are a bit more cyan in person, especially up here. Yet there's not a lot of real detail here, and the highlights are not that bright. So some of these shots, like this one, I overexposed a bit. The highlights are a bit better, but nevertheless, the contrast is still quite low, and most of the shots are very, very dark. When I brought the scans into Lightroom and tried white balancing them, something hit me very quickly. With a lot of additional warmth and magenta to take out the green, you get a tungsten look. And it looks very similar to my old Kodak Ektachrome 64T. Another thing that caught me off guard when I was scanning these is that there's no grain. Well, there is, but there's almost none. Compared to the negatives, it's not there at all. Then I looked at one of the photos of the Bord Gáis Energy Theatre, and the text is so crisp and clear. The resolution is extremely high. If we're talking about needing 2 or so stops of exposure compensation when cross-processing, getting finer grain and higher detail and a sort of tungsten look when cross-processing of slides, could it be that Phoenix is actually a tungsten balanced slide film at some technical level that we are cross-processing as C41 film? I have no confirmation or actual basis to suggest any of this, but the results here are really cool. Again, they're worthless for projecting. The colors are not great for that, but for scanning, that's very interesting. So overall, I would call both of these tests a success in that I learned a lot from both of them. Pushing the film 2 stops to 800 works okay if you have good light. If you're working in very high contrast scenes, your shadows are just gone and you have to forget about them. But if you were to underexpose it just a stop and a half, push it 2 stops in development, overdevelop 2 stops, but only underexpose by a stop and a half, as I said earlier, you can get some really nice results. And again, the increase in contrast and grain isn't actually that significant because the film is so grainy and contrasty to begin with. And the colors still seem pretty good, so I think that's a pretty fair trade-off. I probably wouldn't do 3 stops. Someone's welcome to try that. 1 stop probably isn't worth it. But I do think the look of the shots where I kind of rated it, like 500 to 640 again, I think those look pretty good. As for cross-processing, could it be that they were trying to replicate Kodak Ektachrome 64T in a sense? I don't know, but it's really interesting, and I think I'm gonna have to finally buy an 85B and do some more playing around with this film as a slide, because the results are actually really, really good. I think that's all I have to say for this video, so stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.